our final expansion team to tackle here is the Guangzhou Charge, who are an interesting team, in my opinion, because when I was doing this preview show, that we did, I think on something like the 5th of December, a live 2-hour show, and I wasn't as clued in on all of the players and teams as I am now. Obviously, I've spent the break doing a lot of prep work, and the teams had just been released at that point, so I hadn't had time to go back and look through all the VODs and look at the teams and stuff like that. At that point in December, when the rosters had first been announced, I thought the Guangzhou Charge looked like one of the weakest teams on paper in the league. And I thought they might be down there with the Justice and Mayhem and teams like that. But after looking into them a bit more, I felt better and better about them. I feel like they're doing a lot of things correctly, which I'll talk about later in this video. But it's possible that I may have gone too far the other way, from rating them maybe like I think my initial rating, if you'd asked me to do a power ranking during that preview show, would have been somewhere around like the 18th. I think I would have put them maybe 17th. I feel like I may have gone too far the other way now, though, after reflection, because my power rankings had them at 12th. Which is pretty high, honestly, isn't it? I've got them above the Toronto Defiant, the Shanghai Dragons, the Atlanta Reign as well. 3 teams that certainly could contest them and finish better in the season than them, I think. So let me try and justify myself, I suppose. I think the range that this team could sit at is somewhere around, I think if they really don't do very well, I think they could sit somewhere around the 17th range. I think they still could be the poorest, not the poorest of the expansion teams, but down there. And I think the highest they could do is around 9th, 8th, sneak into playoffs, that kind of thing. And so normally I've tended towards the lower end. When I've thought about these ranges, I've tended towards the lower end because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with these teams. But with the Guangzhou Charge, I feel slightly differently. I feel like we might get more consistency from the Guangzhou Charge than we will from or that we could from the Defiant or from Atlanta, these kind of teams. And the reason for this is they have a core that they built on from Metabellum, who were making very consistent results. Not great results, but very consistent semi-final results over the course of their rosters. They don't have to deal that much with communication issues, and I'll go into that later, which some of the other teams do and could be a big stumbling block. And they do actually have some star talents that I expect some decent things out of. So rather than tending towards the lower end, they've kind of hopped over some of the hurdles that might face some other expansion teams, which is why I've been generous with my rankings and said that I think we could expect something more consistent from the Guangzhou Charge and expect them to settle somewhere just below the middle, somewhere at around a 12th spot. But that might be me overrating them slightly, I do admit. So let's have a look. This team has 4 players from Metabellum, as far as I'm aware. Yeah, I'm right in saying that. Yes. But they're not really in duos, so they haven't taken the tank duo, or they've taken the support duo, but it's likely to be split up. So it's kind of spread across the roster. And that's interesting to me because it's not like the LA Gladiators from Season 1, where they chose a backline from one team and a tank line from another team and try and mesh them together. They've kind of got a running core throughout the team of Metabellum, but with better players plugged in. So they've got some kind of system to work off. Most of the players know how to play with each other. They've got some kind of fundamentals there. And the meta players, crucially as well, I think have been taking English classes while they were in Korea. So that puts them at a big advantage over some of these other teams that are trying to integrate Chinese players into Korean teams, or integrate English-speaking players or English-speaking coaches into Korean-speaking teams, or integrate Korean players into English-speaking teams. They should have a leg up on the competition in that sense. They are, I think, the only mixed roster of the expansion teams that are speaking English. Chengdu is presumably going to communicate in Mandarin because they're all from China, apart from one guy from Taiwan, right? That's Bacon Jack, but it still speaks Mandarin. Spark and Shanghai are presumably going to be speaking in Korean because they have pretty much full Korean teams, but with a couple of Chinese players sprinkled in. So it would be odd for them to communicate in English or Mandarin. That would be very strange. And Guangzhou are the other expansion team that's mixed, and they are speaking in English because they have guys like Kib and Nero, who Kib's from England, Nero's from America, two fairly talented up-and-coming players that they need to integrate into the system and don't speak Mandarin or Korean as far as I'm aware. So it's a huge deal that these Metabellum players speak English to the level where they're able to communicate effectively. It means so much, and you might see people go on about communication issues a lot and not know why they really push it that hard, because I've noticed some people poo-poo the idea of communication issues not being that bad, being like, oh, but they speak good enough English to communicate in game, right? Like, they know what tracer, right, left, glass, different call-outs on maps mean. They know what peel is or what certain calls mean, disengage, back off. But I think Deepay from the LA Gladiators has a very good take on this, where he says, when we were doing, we meaning Deepay, when he was doing VOD reviews with the LA Gladiators, you have to allocate 30 minutes to go through it in English and then assume it's going to take another 30 minutes to go through it in Korean. It's very difficult to be able to have the Korean players understand what's going on at the same time as you're doing that VOD review in English. The direct communication is pretty difficult for most translators, and I think it's only really the LA Valiant that have pulled this off to a decent level. And you can't just rely on their basic communication skills when you're trying to explain a tactic that has to really be absorbed and understood. You need to know exactly where to rotate if X happens. You need to know what other people on your team are doing and the reason why they're doing it, so that if things go weird in a match, you know what their next move might be and you know how to support them effectively. So communication is important out of the game as well as inside of it. And I think for this reason, Guangzhou Charge will have a bit of a step up on some of the other competition in that sense, because their communication foundations should be a bit more stable. So who are these players? Let's go through their roster. On main tank, they have Rio, a guy that is a pretty solid main tank. He's not really the carry main tank. He's not going to go out there and put out ridiculous performances, I think, but he rarely makes mistakes. He seems to have a pretty solid style to him. Maybe you'd compare him to somebody like Fate from the LA Valiant, but I don't think he's at Fate's level. Sometimes Fate can honestly take over a game, and he's very constricting in how he positions himself, and Fate and Space do rarely make mistakes, at least not in playoff, when they're not playing playoff games. So I'd expect Rio to be a very solid main tank for this team. I think he's going to be similar level but completely different style to the main tanks from the Spark, from the Defiant, stuff like this. A good solid middle of the pack main tank. Then on off tank, they've got Hotba, who was traded from the Philadelphia Fusion, which is a weird pickup, honestly. It makes sense from Philadelphia Fusion's point of view. They really want to focus on Poco next season. That makes sense. Hotba did play in the finals a little bit and in the playoffs for the Philadelphia Fusion and looked pretty decent in that meta. If you remember, it was the one where the Diva player had to flex off to a bunch of other roles, had to play... Oh, well, it didn't have to, but the way that they'd set it up, they had Hotba doing that. So Hotba would play the Tracer and then Boombox would play the Roadhog or something like this. So that was really interesting to me, and he seems pretty capable on DPS. And that's interesting because we might be getting into a meta. We've seen glimpses in trials and whispers from scrims of a triple or quad DPS where your off tank has to go over to DPS. That could be a decent meta for Hotba. And just more in general, I feel like he was a pretty decent off tank. He was on a similar level to Poco, I think. He just didn't have those crazy bombs that everybody knew Poco for, and didn't seem to progress at the same rate, and didn't have the same synergy with Sado that we might have hoped for once he was actually allowed into the team in Stage 4. So I think that this duo could be pretty solid. I don't think it's going to be one of the best tank lines in the league, but I think it's going to be pretty decent. Then on DPS, they've got Happy and Kib, and Nero and Eileen. So I'll do Happy and Kib first. Happy is a nut. He's another guy from Metabellum. Played with Rio and also played with Chara and Rise, who are the supports who I'll get onto in a bit. Happy's Widowmaker is bananas. It's probably the best Widowmaker coming into the league, like brand new, fresh. Bazzi from the Hangzhou Spark might have something to say about that, but my money would be on Happy. He's incredible. If there's any Widowmaker metas or any possibility for Widowmaker to have a large impact, if you can run him in some of these like high DPS scenarios or in really niche strategies where you can get the most out of him, he's going to go huge. His hero pool outside of that Widowmaker isn't massive, though, as far as I can tell. He plays a pretty good Zarya within a GOATS meta, and I don't know much else about him. He plays a lot of Widowmaker, so I don't know whether he's the kind of player that is just going to pick up a bunch of different hit scans and be really good. That would be awesome if he is, but they do have the depth on their roster to use Happy as just kind of the Widowmaker Zarya kind of player for the team, and maybe he can pick up another couple of heroes if the meta allows it. Kib is much more of your flex guy. Kib is super flexible, and honestly, over the last year, he's become much more intelligent with how he plays as well, and a lot better at some of these heroes. People that haven't watched him in a while might remember him for playing like an okay Genji and like an okay Hog he used to play as well, and a pretty good Junkrat. But he's taken these pocket picks that he used to be known for and pushed them to the next level, I think, to the point where he's a pretty scary Hog, a pretty scary Genji. He's still got a good Junkrat, and also plays the Brigitte really well. Anybody who's watching the World Cup can see that he's got that down to a T, and he's a really intelligent guy as well. So I think this is a great pickup for the Guangzhou Charge, and because he shouldn't struggle that much integrating with the communication system, I think I'm expecting big things from Kib. Now, the other two players that they've got on DPS are Nero and Eileen. Now, Nero doesn't become available until something like May 27th. I might just be talking to my ass there. Let's have a look. Nero Liquipedia. But he's an underage player, as far as I'm aware, from America. And May the 31st. Okay, I was pretty close. So he doesn't become available until not quite halfway through the season, but, you know, a decent portion into the season. But he's a very a raw talent, I think, that can be developed and is pretty good on a range of different heroes. He's been playing for a year now, maybe a little bit more, within the North American contender scene, and he looks like somebody that if you give him a good team to play around and give him good coaching and good direction and let him play in OWL where he's playing against the best players in the world, I think he could be one of the best North American DPS players. Now, that might not be saying too much, though, because there aren't that many good North American DPS players. But, I mean, if this guy turns out to be like the next Sinatra or something like that, you've got a really good player just sat there on the bench waiting to be developed. So, a good pickup from them, I think. Especially for this team, because, again, no issues with communicating in English. Then they have Eileen, who you might remember from the, was it 2017 World Cup China team? He's pretty similar to guys like Crystal or Leave. I wouldn't say he's as good as those guys, and I would say he's slightly more aggressive. So what they've got on their roster is a Chinese player that will have to learn to communicate in English, because I don't think his English skills are that great. And he's a very aggressive but mechanically talented player on stuff like Genji and the rest of the flex DPS, and I think he can also play Widowmaker to a decent level, though you wouldn't expect him to play that because Happy would. But, you know, there might be some meta where you have to play Genji and Widowmaker on one player. So he's a good guy also to have on the bench and slowly integrate over the course of the season. I don't think he's going to be somebody they need in order to get star performances. Honestly, I think Happy and Kib is a pretty good DPS duo, especially if you get on anything that requires a Widowmaker. And then when Nero's unlocked, maybe he ends up being good for the team. But I can see some star players on this team, right? They have like a good core, and then they have certain star players where if they meet their potential, this team could actually like make some upset results, make some decent runs, be able to make the playoffs. And then their support line has Chara and Rise, who were the supports for Metabellum, who are a pretty decent support duo, honestly. Chara seems like he's got a good handle over Mercy and Lucio. I don't think he's outstanding, but he's pretty solid. And then Rise used to be called 1J Lee, was the Zenyatta player mostly for that team. And he looked okay as well. I don't think he looked incredible, but he looked okay. And when you compare him to the rest of the competition in OWL, he'd be able to hold his own. I think he'd be on the same level as some of the kind of lower level flex supports within the league, but they're still phenomenally talented. I mean, we're talking about guys like I don't know, some of the European flex supports at that point. I mean, we're talking about guys like Hip or Gray or Shaz or something like that. Like, these guys aren't incredible within the Overwatch League, but they are incredible players. It's just that there's that much depth on the flex support. But they do actually have a guy that really could make waves on Zenyatta, and that's Shu, who used to play for Toronto Esports. And he's really mechanically talented. He's a young guy. I think he's only just 18 or something like that. But I would expect Chara and Shu to be played full-time as the support duo for this team. And Shu is pretty nuts. Even when he was playing for Toronto Esports, who had a lot of talent but never really kind of meshed it together, he looked pretty good. So when he's actually got a good team around him, like Guangzhou Charge, I think he should be able to be a pretty good Zenyatta. I would expect him to be average to above average within the Overwatch League, which I think is saying a lot for flex support players. So they've got a solid backline with a potential star on Zenyatta. They've got a solid tank line, and they've got a solid and flexible DPS line with some potential stars. So on paper, this looks like a roster that's got some that at its worst would be, all right, and at its best could make a run for playoffs. So we'll see what they're able to do with it. And I think it's interesting the way that this core is going to work, because just as a final point, for anyone that didn't pick up on what I was saying previously about the core and the way that it's distributed, they got Rio on main tank, who's from Metabellum. Then they have Happy from Metabellum, who's probably going to be playing Widowmaker or some other star hit scan if he manages to pick it up throughout the season. And then they have the main support, because we're expecting 1J Lee Rise to be on the bench for Shu. So there is potential there, a slight concern, that the idea that I have in my head of them having a good foundation, a good core to build on, might not be the case. We'll have to wait and see. But I think this team should be fairly flexible, and I'm expecting some interesting stuff from them throughout the season, throughout a bunch of different metas. And certainly if they get on the right meta for this team, they could be pretty dangerous.